August 3, 1993, and the small town of Deadwood, South Dakota, was experiencing peak tourist season, with visitors exploring the historic Old West town famous for its gold rush history, casinos, and Wild Bill Hickok connections. Main Street was crowded with families visiting museums, shops selling Western memorabilia, and restaurants offering authentic frontier cuisine, and the sidewalks were packed with people enjoying the warm summer afternoon. Dylan Parker was 9 years old that Tuesday afternoon, a boy with dark blonde hair styled in a buzz cut, blue eyes, a gap between his front two teeth, and an outgoing personality that made him talk to everyone he met. He wore khaki cargo shorts with multiple pockets, a red polo shirt with white collar, white athletic socks pulled up to mid-calf, black and white high-top sneakers, and he carried a small black backpack containing his Game Boy and snacks. Dylan had come to Deadwood with his father, Mark Parker, a single parent raising Dylan alone after his wife had died from cancer when Dylan was 5, and they were on a summer road trip exploring South Dakota. At approximately 3:15 p.m., they were walking along Main Street after visiting the Adams Museum, and Dylan asked if he could go into a nearby arcade while Mark stopped at an ATM to withdraw cash. "The arcade is right there, I can see it from the ATM," Mark said at 3:17 p.m. "Go ahead and play games and I'll come get you in 10 minutes after I get money and check the map for our next stop." The arcade was a small storefront about 40 feet from the ATM, with large windows that allowed Mark to see inside from where he'd be standing, and Dylan had visited similar arcades throughout their trip. Dylan walked to the arcade and disappeared inside, and Mark could see him through the window moving toward the game machines in the back of the narrow space. Mark stepped to the ATM at 3:18 p.m. and began his transaction, which took approximately 2 minutes, including entering his PIN, selecting withdrawal amount, and waiting for the machine to process and dispense cash. At 3:20 p.m., Mark completed the ATM transaction and looked toward the arcade expecting to see Dylan playing games through the large windows, but he couldn't see his son anywhere inside the visible area. Mark walked to the arcade entrance thinking Dylan had moved to a game that wasn't visible from outside, and when he entered, the owner was at the counter, and 2 teenagers were playing fighting games. "Did you see a 9-year-old come in here a few minutes ago, blonde buzz cut, red shirt, carrying a backpack?" Mark asked, and the owner said yes. A boy matching that description had entered, but had left through the back door almost immediately. The arcade had a rear exit that led to an alley behind Main Street, an exit Mark hadn't known existed, and when he asked why Dylan would have left that way, the owner said the boy had seemed to be following someone. "A man came in, looked around, and went straight to the back door," the owner explained, "and the kid followed him out. Maybe 5 seconds later, I figured they were together." Mark ran to the back door and into the alley, calling Dylan's name urgently, and the alley was empty with access to parking areas and side streets that led away from Main Street. In approximately 3 minutes, while his father completed an ATM transaction 40 feet away with visual line of sight to the arcade, 9-year-old Dylan Parker followed someone through a back exit and vanished. If you want to hear how this case was finally solved after 31 years, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's continue. Mark immediately called Deadwood police from a payphone at 3:25 p.m., and officers arrived within minutes to search the area and obtain descriptions of Dylan and the man who'd allegedly led him through the back exit. The arcade owner provided what limited description he could: a man in his 40s or 50s, average height and build, wearing a baseball cap and dark clothing, but he hadn't paid close attention and couldn't provide detailed facial features. "I see dozens of people every hour," the owner apologized, "and I wasn't watching carefully because I thought the kid and the man were together, like father and son going out the back way." The alley behind Main Street was searched thoroughly, and investigators found it provided access to multiple parking areas where someone could have quickly gotten Dylan into a vehicle. Bloodhounds arrived by 5 p.m. and tracked Dylan's scent from the arcade through the back door and into the alley, where it led to a parking area about 50 yards away before ending completely. This pattern suggested Dylan had been placed in a vehicle at that location, and investigators began the difficult task of trying to identify every car that had been parked in that area during the critical time frame. By evening, over 100 law enforcement officers and volunteers were searching Deadwood and surrounding areas, checking hotels, campgrounds, abandoned mine sites, and any location where a 9-year-old might have been taken. The description of the man who'd led Dylan through the arcade's back exit was frustratingly vague, and attempts to create a composite sketch produced an image so generic it could match thousands of middle-aged men. Detective Robert Chen arrived from Rapid City by 7:00 p.m. and immediately focused on the arcade owner's statement that Dylan had followed the man, suggesting the boy hadn't been grabbed or forced, but had gone willingly. "Did the man say anything to Dylan inside the arcade?" Chen asked the owner, who explained the interaction had been so brief he hadn't heard any conversation, just saw the man go to the back and Dylan follow seconds later. This suggested the man might have gestured or indicated silently for Dylan to follow, or had established some kind of rapport that made Dylan trust him enough to leave through an unfamiliar exit. FBI was contacted given the potential for child abduction across state lines, and Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from the Minneapolis field office with resources and experience from similar cases. Agent Wells theorized that someone had been watching Dylan and Mark, had seen Mark go to the ATM leaving Dylan alone, and had entered the arcade specifically to lure the boy away during that brief window. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, Wells believed, which meant someone had been following the Parker family or had been watching for vulnerable children in the tourist district. By Wednesday morning, the case had become major news across South Dakota and neighboring states, with Dylan's photo appearing on television showing his buzz-cut and gap-toothed smile, and the red polo shirt and black backpack were emphasized repeatedly. Tips flooded in from tourists who'd been in Deadwood on Tuesday, but despite hundreds of people on Main Street, nobody recalled seeing a man in a baseball cap leading a 9-year-old boy through an alley or parking area. One witness reported seeing a dark blue sedan leaving the parking area behind Main Street around 3:25 p.m., driving faster than the posted limit, but couldn't provide details about the make, model, or license plate. This vague description became a lead that investigators pursued, though tracking such a common vehicle type without more specific information proved nearly impossible. By late August, the intensive daily search operations had been scaled back after 3 weeks produced no trace of Dylan, despite thousands of volunteer hours and extensive professional investigation. Mark was devastated, unable to forgive himself for the 2-minute ATM transaction that had given someone the opportunity to take his son, and he struggled with crushing guilt. "I could see the arcade from where I was standing," Mark told reporters. "I thought Dylan was safe inside playing games. I never imagined there was a back door, and now my son is gone because I looked away for 2 minutes." The case was featured on America's Most Wanted in September 1993, and the broadcast generated thousands of tips, but investigation revealed each was either mistaken identity or well-meaning but inaccurate information. Detective Chen investigated registered sex offenders who'd been in the Deadwood area in early August, and several were located and interviewed, but none matched the vague description or raised specific suspicions. One name that came up was Walter Green, a 49-year-old man who lived in Rapid City and who'd been convicted of child endangerment in 1985, though not for sexual offenses. Green worked as a truck driver and frequently traveled through Deadwood, and he owned a dark blue 1989 Ford Taurus sedan that matched the general description of the vehicle seen leaving the parking area. But when investigators interviewed Green, he had receipts showing he'd been delivering a load to Wyoming on August 3rd and couldn't have been in Deadwood during the time Dylan disappeared. By 2000, the case had essentially gone cold with periodic reviews but no active investigation, and Dylan Parker became another child who'd vanished from a tourist town, despite his father being just feet away. Age progression photos were created showing what Dylan might look like at 15, 20, 25, 35, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases as years passed. Mark never remarried and carried profound guilt about the ATM stop that had created the opportunity for Dylan's abduction, and he spent years searching and investigating every theory. The black backpack with Dylan's Game Boy was never found, presumably taken with him or discarded by whoever had abducted him from the arcade. By 2010, 17 years after Dylan's disappearance, Mark had become a shadow of himself, consumed by grief and guilt, and he died from liver failure at age 52. His health destroyed by years of alcoholism and depression. His obituary mentioned that he was predeceased by his son Dylan, whose disappearance had defined Mark's final 17 years and had ultimately contributed to his early death. Dylan's case remained unsolved, and with no family left to advocate for him, it became one of hundreds of cold cases in South Dakota law enforcement files, reviewed occasionally but with no active investigation. Detective James Morrison took over cold cases in 2015, and he was struck by Dylan's file and the precise timing of the abduction, which suggested sophisticated planning rather than random opportunity. Morrison investigated whether the arcade had been targeted specifically, wondering if the back exit had been known to predators who used it to lure children away from Main Street's crowds. But the arcade had closed in 2005 after the owner retired, and the building had been converted to a gift shop with the back door permanently sealed, eliminating the physical evidence of how Dylan had been taken. By 2020, Dylan would have been 36 years old, and age progression photos showed a man with dark blonde hair who might have been athletic like his father, though most investigators believed he died in 1993. True crime podcasts discovered Dylan's case in the early 2020s, and several shows featured episodes about the Deadwood arcade disappearance and the 2-minute ATM transaction that had changed everything. In January 2024, South Dakota State Police received an unusual call from a woman named Margaret Foster, who lived in Montana and had recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Margaret explained that her brother, Gary Foster, had died in a car accident in December 2023, and while cleaning out his house, she'd found disturbing items that made her believe he'd been involved in crimes. Gary had boxes of children's items in his basement hidden behind a false wall, Margaret explained, and there were photographs and newspaper clippings about missing children, including one about Dylan Parker from Deadwood in 1993. South Dakota investigators traveled to Montana to examine what Margaret had found, and among Gary Foster's possessions were dozens of items suggesting a long history of interest in children. Most disturbingly, they found a black backpack containing a Nintendo Game Boy with Dylan P. scratched into the back, and this discovery immediately connected Gary Foster to the 31-year-old cold case. Detective Sarah Chen took over the investigation, and background research revealed that Gary Foster had been 47 in 1993 and had worked as a traveling salesman, which put him in various towns across the region regularly. Foster had been investigated in 1987 for inappropriate contact with a child in Iowa, but charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, and he'd continued working and traveling for decades without further legal trouble. Most significantly, records showed Foster had been in Deadwood on August 3, 1993 for a sales meeting, which placed him in the right location at the exact time Dylan had disappeared. Foster owned a 1992 dark blue Chevrolet Cavalier in 1993, matching the witness description of a dark blue sedan, leaving the parking area behind Main Street around the time of the abduction. Among Foster's possessions, investigators found a journal where he'd written extensively about children he'd encountered during his travels, and one entry from August 1993 was particularly damning. Deadwood was productive, the entry read. Found exactly what I was looking for at the arcade, easier than expected. The father wasn't paying attention, and the back exit made everything simple. The journal described how Foster had followed Mark and Dylan along Main Street, had seen Mark stop at the ATM, and had entered the arcade knowing he'd have a brief window of opportunity. I gestured for the boy to follow me, told him his dad had sent me to get him, Foster wrote, and he came willingly, trusting and obedient, and we were out the back and in my car before anyone noticed. The journal indicated Foster had driven Dylan to a remote location in the Black Hills, approximately 30 miles from Deadwood, and what had happened there was described in language that confirmed Dylan had been murdered. Detective Chen organized search teams to locate the area described in Foster's journal, and in March 2024, investigators found remains buried in a wooded area that matched the location details. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to the State Forensic Laboratory, and preliminary examination confirmed they were a child approximately 9 years old who'd been deceased for approximately 3 decades. DNA testing was immediately ordered, comparing the remains to genetic samples collected from Mark Parker before his death in 2010, samples that had been preserved in databases for exactly this possibility. The DNA analysis took 12 weeks, and when results came back in June 2024, they showed a 99.94% probability that the remains were Dylan Parker, missing since August 1993 from Deadwood. The confirmation devastated the few people who'd known Dylan, including his father's sister, Patricia, who'd been Dylan's only surviving relative and who'd never stopped wondering what had happened to her nephew. Mark died not knowing, Patricia sobbed when informed. He spent 17 years blaming himself and drinking himself to death, and now we know Dylan was killed within hours of being taken, and my brother never got to know the truth. The medical examiner determined that Dylan had died from asphyxiation, likely within hours of the abduction, and that his body had been buried in the remote location where it remained undiscovered for 31 years. This timeline meant that while Mark had been desperately searching Deadwood and surrounding areas in August 1993, Dylan had already been deceased, hidden in the Black Hills in a grave Gary Foster had prepared. Detective Chen's investigation confirmed that Foster had used his sales job as cover for traveling to various towns where he'd identify and abduct children when opportunities arose. The items found in Foster's basement suggested Dylan hadn't been his only victim, and investigators began comparing Foster's travel records to unsolved child disappearance cases across the region. Evidence suggested Foster had been responsible for at least 3 other child abductions between 1987 and 2005, though confirming these connections required extensive investigation that was ongoing. The case against Foster was definitive despite his death. The journal entries, Dylan's backpack and Game Boy, Foster's presence in Deadwood on August 3, 1993, and the remains found in the location he'd described. South Dakota prosecutors held a press conference in July 2024, announcing that Dylan Parker's disappearance had been solved, that he'd been murdered by Gary Foster, and that Foster had died before facing justice. The announcement brought closure to a case that had haunted Deadwood for 31 years, though the knowledge that Dylan had died so quickly after being taken and that Foster had never been caught was bitterly painful. Patricia Parker attended the press conference and spoke about her brother Mark, who'd destroyed himself with guilt over the 2-minute ATM transaction, never knowing that no amount of vigilance could have prevented what Foster had planned. "My brother blamed himself for 37 years until the day he died," Patricia said. "And now I know that Gary Foster had been watching and waiting, and he would have found another opportunity if not that day, because this is what he did. This was who he was." Dylan was buried in August 2024 beside his father Mark and his mother, who'd died when Dylan was 5, finally reuniting the family that had been torn apart by cancer and then by a predator's crime. Over 200 people attended the funeral service to honor the 9-year-old who'd been taken during what should have been a happy summer vacation, and to remember the father who'd never recovered from losing him. The arcade building in Deadwood, now a gift shop, installed a memorial plaque explaining Dylan's story and warning parents about the importance of knowing all exits in buildings where children play. The case brought renewed attention to how predators study spaces and plan abductions, using architectural features like back exits to quickly remove children from public areas. And it highlighted the danger of traveling criminals who exploit their mobility to commit crimes in different jurisdictions where they're unknown and can avoid detection. Gary Foster's sister Margaret, who'd reported his possessions to police, struggled with guilt about not having known her brother was a child killer, though investigators assured her she'd done the right thing by coming forward. "I wish I'd known years ago," Margaret told reporters. "I wish I'd found that basement room while Gary was alive so he could have faced justice. But at least now the families have answers and can bury their children." By late 2024, 31 years after Dylan Parker vanished from a Deadwood arcade, his case stood as a reminder that some predators operate for decades before being identified, and that justice sometimes comes only after death. Detective Chen continued investigating Gary Foster's background and travel records, identifying at least 5 unsolved child disappearances from the late 1980s through early 2000s that matched his patterns and locations. In each case, Foster had been in the area during the time frame of the disappearance, and while definitive proof was difficult to establish decades later, circumstantial evidence strongly suggested his involvement. Chen worked with law enforcement in multiple states to search locations mentioned in Foster's journals, and in September 2024, remains of 2 additional children were found in Wyoming and Nebraska. DNA testing confirmed these remains were children who'd gone missing in 1995 and 1998, cases that had been cold for decades until Foster's death and his sister's discovery finally provided answers. The realization that Foster had been a serial child predator who'd operated across multiple states for nearly 20 years was devastating to law enforcement and communities that had lived with unsolved disappearances. Patricia Parker became an advocate for better coordination between states in tracking traveling criminals, testifying before Congress about the need for improved information sharing. Gary Foster drove through multiple states for his job, Patricia explained. And he used that mobility to find victims in places where he was unknown, and law enforcement in different states didn't connect the cases because they didn't know one person was responsible. Congress passed legislation in 2025 requiring enhanced tracking of violent offenders who travel for work, creating databases that flag when individuals with concerning histories move between jurisdictions. The reforms, known as Dillon's Law, also mandated that businesses catering to children document all exits and provide maps showing evacuation routes, ensuring parents know about back doors and alternative exits. Deadwood transformed the alley where Dillon had been taken into a memorial garden with benches and flowers, and a statue of a young boy holding a backpack stands at the center. The inscription reads, Dillon Parker, 1984-1993, taken too soon, found after 31 years. May his memory protect other children, and families visit the space to remember Dillon and reflect on child safety. The arcade owner who'd witnessed Dillon following Foster through the back exit struggled with guilt for not having intervened, though investigators assured him he'd had no reason to suspect danger at the time. I thought they were together, the now elderly man told reporters, and I've spent 31 years wondering if I could have stopped it by paying more attention, and now I know I was watching a kidnapping happen and didn't realize it. The case proved that predators can appear normal and blend into tourist crowds, watching for vulnerable children and exploiting brief moments when parents are distracted. It demonstrated that even 2-minute separations can be enough for prepared abductors to act, especially when they've studied locations and identified escape routes in advance. And it showed that some criminals operate for decades, dying before being caught, but that physical evidence and journals can still provide answers to families who've searched for years. Patricia established the Dillon Parker Foundation, supporting families of murdered children, providing resources for investigations, DNA testing, and the emotional support needed to survive devastating losses. The foundation also funded training for law enforcement on recognizing patterns in traveling criminals and connecting cases across jurisdictions that might be linked to single predators. Mark Parker's grave was updated to note that Dillon had been found and that the case had been solved, giving some posthumous peace to a father who died without answers. Patricia visits the graves regularly and tells them about the foundation's work and the children who've been found through improved investigation techniques. I tell Mark that Dillon came home, Patricia said, and I tell them both about the reforms that happened because of Dillon's case, and I hope wherever they are, they know their story has helped protect other children. The story of Dillon Parker reminds us that 9-year-olds should be safe in arcades while fathers complete ATM transactions, that back exits can be used by predators to quickly remove victims, and that some cases take decades to solve. It proves that physical evidence preserved for decades can eventually reveal truth, and that family members who report suspicious findings after relatives' deaths can be heroes to families seeking closure. And in Deadwood, where tourists still walk Main Street and families create vacation memories, Dillon's memorial stands as a reminder that vigilance matters and that predators can be anyone, anywhere, watching and waiting. The black backpack with Dillon's Game Boy was returned to Patricia after being held as evidence, and she donated it to a museum exhibit about missing children, where Dillon's story educates visitors about child safety. The case stands as testament to the importance of never closing cold cases, of preserving evidence even when decades pass without leads, and of listening to family members who report concerning discoveries. And 31 years after a 9-year-old followed a stranger through an arcade's back exit, Dillon Parker's family finally had answers, and his memory became a force for protecting other children. Patricia continues her advocacy work, traveling to speak about Dillon's case and the importance of cross-jurisdictional cooperation in catching predators who move between states. Gary Foster should have been caught in 1987 after the Iowa incident, Patricia told lawmakers, and if there had been better tracking and information sharing, Dillon and the other children might still be alive. So we need systems that prevent predators from just moving to new locations and continuing to hurt kids. The reforms inspired by Dillon's case have helped solve 17 additional cold cases as of 2025, as improved databases allow investigators to identify patterns in traveling criminals that weren't visible before. And Dillon Parker, taken during a 2-minute ATM stop on a summer vacation, is finally home beside his parents. His story a tragic reminder that predators watch and wait, and that vigilance and better systems can protect other children from similar fates.